This sounds like the beginning of a cheesy joke, but I promise it isn't. The inventor of the Post-it note, Spencer Silver, died a few years ago in 2021. His invention, you might know, began as something of a design flaw, as the Post-it adhesive would not actually work in aircraft construction as he had hoped. But the invention is so shockingly obvious, something that can stick but not for long, it stays for a while without leaving a mark, a temporary note. And yet it took 6 years for Silver to get someone to see the value of the idea. When Spencer Silver died, the poet Michael Mark wrote a poem where he imagined himself with a stack of Post-it notes, each one reading temporary. I pressed them onto socks, silverware, bills, my hair. I put one on each maple tree in the yard and notice I don't think of them as eternal as much. All it takes is a single written word on red, yellow, green tags to remind me the car isn't mine. The house isn't mine. Later in the poem, Mark considers how, when placed on those in hospice beds, temporary transitions to still here. Then he says, babies are so hard, I almost can't. And when I read this poem in mid-2021, I thought, that's Ash Wednesday. Each of us marked with a reminder that we are temporary. Yes, temporality, temporariness tends to make things deeply impersonal and therefore kind of difficult to love. On this Ash Wednesday, on Valentine's Day, I wonder, how do we love what is temporary? The psalmist speaks the truth about humanity, how we are only briefly on this earth. Later in Psalm 103, she writes, calling us grass, mere flowers of the field blown away on the wind with nothing to show that we were here. We often believe that temporariness is a design flaw, that we are weak because we are limited, that afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labor, sleepless nights, hunger keep us from eternity and at some point render us unlovable. In our fear, our great temptation is to turn away, often in disgust, from dust and dirt and mud, from soot and sludge and stain. We cringe at the unwashed and shame the dirty. We drop bombs on the unclean, and the few that emerge from the weight of the blast come out covered in the dust of what they once had and who they once were. We build walls to the edges of the desert for the uncared for, and they must risk the dust and the dry and the heat. We see the mud slide and the silt swirl in floodwaters, and we just keep on driving and drilling and deforesting. We call each other names and run our enemies' noses in the mud. In our fear and distress, we pretend that they, and not we, are the ones who are temporary. But we have all felt the sands of reality slip through our fingers, still living as we are in the shadow of the pandemic, still wondering what we are to make of what we endure and what we lose. Even when we hide from it, we know that we too are dust. But before calling us temporary, the psalmist says that the Lord has compassion for us because God knows how we were made and remembers that we are dust. In the very beginning, God gathered up a handful of dust, so dull so as to be nearly nothing, insignificant and unimportant, so opposite the eternal God as to be completely finite. And yet God gathers up this handful of dust and forms it into something of God's likeness and breathes into it God's very self. To love what was finite, God made a person. To love what was temporary, God made it personal. A few months before Michael Mark penned his poem to honor the late Spencer Silver and his invention of the temporary note, Pastor Meredith Dodd wrote her own poem, Ash Wednesday 2021, where she recalled that the last real celebration with her congregation in 2020 was Ash Wednesday. And the last thing I told them, she writes, was that they weren't going to live forever. And that if they looked around at all the ashy reminders, they would see that nobody else would either. And so I told them to start living that way, to be as gentle as they were fragile, as joyful as they were grief-stricken, as tender as they were gritty. That was the last thing I got to tell them before. And I have prayed all year that it has been enough. Remember that you are dust, beloved dust. The practice of this day may not be so much to receive the ashes on our own foreheads, but to bear witness to them placed upon the heads of those we love. Temporary, temporary, temporary. Mere dust and dirt and nothingness. But each cross placed personally. No two alike, especially if I'm the one doing it. Each dark smudge a reminder. Beloved, beloved, beloved. The cross is, after all, the moment that the temporary became personal to God. And so to love what is temporary, make the impersonal personal. Hold nothing and see it as everything. See on each dark cross you witness today, on friend and foe, beloved. See it on the blamed, the slandered, the distrusted, the ignored and invisible, the dying, the punished, the sorrowing, the destitute. See the cross, this mark of loved temporality on forest, pets, songbirds, storm clouds, rainbows, dazzling stars, mountaintops, deep oceans and deserts. On all this temporary creation and on every single person. Beloved, beloved, beloved.